There's something special about David Mitchell. There's an intimacy that comes with just how small the stories are that he tells. Small stories in a relatively small book that carry a weight that can exceed even an epic, and a vision that can be wide enough to hold an entire series. Let me explain. Today we are talking about The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell. This is the same guy who wrote Cloud Atlas. The Bone Clocks is a book. It is a series of short stories, 6 different stories to be specific, all about the main character, Holly Sykes. The first and the last story will have Holly Sykes as the main POV character for the story. The 4 stories in between will have a random different character, and Holly will then play a part in all of the short stories. Obviously, the first and last, she's the main character, and in the ones in between, she will play a varying role. She will appear here and there, and she will come in and out of those stories, playing at sometimes what feels like a pretty minor role, other times a much more major role, but it's really this big long story to kind of give you an idea of the life of Holly Sykes. The stories will take place kind of in their own little bubble, but will jump about a decade in time from each one, sometimes a little bit more. So the stories then start in 1984, moving through time and ending in 2043. Now, the style and the format of the book is extremely reminiscent of the style and the format of Cloud Atlas, considering that it is a series of stories moving forward in time, and they're kind of self-contained stories, but they all have an overarching, thing that it's trying to do and convey to you. Although that one is a little bit different because it does have a Cloud Atlas, kind of has a nesting doll feeling, whereas once you've moved forward through the first half of the stories, then you have to move, the second half of the book has to move backwards in time through the second half of all the stories. Whereas this one, the story is told in whole, and it just goes one to the other, and it moves from the beginning to the end, and then you're done. But it still feels, the way it's told, still feels extremely similar to Cloud Atlas. All the way down to the stories themselves, the tone of the stories and the way they shift and the way some focus on one thing or another thing, all the way down to the fact that there's one story in particular that is just absolutely hilarious, and it's primarily focused on the humorous antics and quick-witted nature of its main character, which is the way one of the stories is told in Cloud Atlas. And it cannot be overstated just how sharp the wit in these books, when he chooses to turn it on, really is, and how effective David Mitchell's humor is. When he wants to be funny, he's hilarious. It is shocking how good he is at humor in his book. And then he'll just drop it and move on to the next story, and it's just gone. It's very impressive. The individual stories then are really focused on doing whatever that individual story is doing, and whatever story it's trying to tell, which is why I said in the beginning that the stories in this feel extremely intimate, because they're not really concerned with the bigger picture or the wider overarching consequences of what is happening in that moment. They're really just concerned about that story that you're reading right now, because the stories genuinely are quite small and quite intimate. Actually, a lot of times it's not even obvious how they will connect to the larger world in general, or how or when Holly's even going to appear in the story, because she doesn't seem to be even a part of what's happening for a good chunk of the beginning of some of these stories. Then you're not even going to really be able to see the overarching story until you're several short stories in. And because you'll see bits and pieces, and you're like, okay, I'm sure that's going to be important. I'm sure that's going to be important. And then about story 3, 4, you're like, now I'm seeing it. I see what I'm supposed to see. And now that you realize what the overarching story is, now you're thinking back and you're trying to put the pieces together. You're like, I caught this, this, and this, but maybe there was something else. And now you're putting more thought into it than probably you should be, or really, maybe more than you need to at the very least. And the stories kind of ebb and flow, and they change tone, and they change style, and they change feeling, and they even kind of change their level of zoom and focus in on Holly and that overarching story, to the point where you're like, what the hell does Holly even have to do with anything at all? But ultimately, that big overarching plot that we've been following this whole time is revealed to be that there are these two groups of immortals that have been essentially battling throughout eternity. Centuries they've been at this, and Holly might have a role to play. She accidentally played a role already, and she might have one yet to play before it's all said and done. And not only is it wonderful, but it's going to end in this big, dramatic, climactic scene that's going to pay off all kinds of things that we've been building up to, wrapping up plot beats and elements that started all the way back in the very first story. It's very well done. It's very satisfying. It's great. It also reveals just the sheer size and scope of the story that we've been following. Because we've been in these little bubbles, it's been hard to get a good zoomed out look at what exactly is going on, and it does a wonderful job of exactly that. And then after that, the book takes it one step further, and it gives us one more story, and that's when it brings it all the way back down to just Holly Sykes. And I genuinely feel like this is where the real magic of the writing of this particular book comes into play, because the book feels like it could have ended already, but it doesn't. And right when it brings the whole thing back down, takes that scale that felt like it had finally reached its large scope and snaps it back down to being a very small scope, very localized story, very tiny, and probably the smallest it's been yet, is right when you realize this is when the story now feels its largest. Somehow now the story, the scope of the story has gotten so big you couldn't grasp it if you wanted to. The consequences are so large, there's nothing anyone could do, no character could do anything about it if they wanted to. And even though a lot of the stakes from before are gone, the consequences now are just too big. And it's not even the consequences of the events of the book. It's just the consequences of reality and existence, period, which is kind of crazy to say, and also why it feels so enormous at the end. Because even though the story itself does get to be pretty expansive and pretty large and pretty bombastic and pretty climactic, it's not in the big expansive climax that it feels the biggest. It's when it snaps down to being intimate, and you realize that the story itself was never about the big battle or the war or whatever it was. It feels like the story was about humanity, human existence, human nature in general. And it's at that point when it feels by far its largest. And then if you've read other pieces of David Mitchell's work and you realize that he has all of his books kind of fit into the same world or universe, or they kind of fit together to a big overarching story, I think, from what I understand. And the only other one I personally have read is Cloud Atlas. But now I find myself going back and trying to piece together exactly how this fits in to that wider world that is Cloud Atlas, because it goes all the way back to like the 1800s and way into the future. So now I'm like trying to figure out exactly how this world fits into that world, and it just makes it that much richer and that much better. Although I will say, I don't feel like you need to read anything else from David Mitchell to read this, fully understand it, and fully appreciate it. The only thing that having read prior David Mitchell books could possibly do, in my opinion, is just enhance and enrich the experience that is reading this book. But I wouldn't be like, well, you're just not going to fully appreciate it if you haven't already experienced David Mitchell. I don't think so. I think if you've never read David Mitchell, you could pick this up, get a good feel for his writing, get a good feel for the way he tells stories and the fun and the flair and all of the stuff. I think you'd be fine. I really don't think there is like a requisite to read something else from him prior to reading this. I think you'd be fine. I would say if I had to drop a rating on it, I would give it probably a solid 8.5. It is a really good book. I think it was fabulous. I don't think it's quite as good as Cloud Atlas. I think that one does a little bit more, although I think that one might be a little bit more obtuse, or I just think Cloud Atlas is a tougher sell because of the nature of getting half the stories, the other half the stories moving forwards, moving backwards. It's just much more difficult to hand that book to somebody and be like, I'll promise you'll love it, because it's not for everybody. Really much. This is much more of an easy sell as a David Mitchell book than I think Cloud Atlas is, because boy, that one's, I want that word, prohibitive. I think that one's much more prohibitive. That might be the word I've been looking for this whole time. Anyway, I think this one's a great book. I think it's a good, solid 8.5. As always, everybody, the link for my Patreon's in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.